But the basic story there is that she has always kind of been coming around to this character of Kalof. The way Puccini and his librettists depicted Turandot posed some very real problems for them, because they had created this character who was completely implacable. And now all of a sudden they had to make her change. They had to bring her around to a character that audiences would sympathize with. And that was the real issue for them. And that was the thing that Puccini was most concerned about. He made these two gentlemen rewrite the ending no fewer than 4 times. And he still wasn't entirely satisfied with it. He felt that he could get to a place where he had an ending he could work with. But then he ended up going to Brussels, undergoing this awful treatment for his cancer, and then eventually dying. So as we listen to and watch this work, I think it's interesting to imagine that a composer like Puccini, so self-assured, so confident, had some very difficult times making this story work. And a question that you might ask yourself, it's a rhetorical question and I can't answer it for you, is did he succeed? Is this opera successful? Does it work as a piece of theater? That's up to you. Now, I've got some question time and I'd love to take some, so please ask away. Yes, arms go right up. Yes, I saw you first. How old was Puccini when he died? He was 65. Yes? Great question. The obligation of the librettist as opposed to the composer. Whenever Puccini worked with, and I'll use Puccini as an example because it could be different with other composers, but whenever Puccini worked with 2 librettists, one of those gentlemen was involved with basically crafting the scenario of taking the original source material, kind of pruning it, paring it down, and creating the basic story. Then the other gentleman was assigned the task of turning that into some sort of verse, of crafting what we might call the lyrics. Now the division wasn't exact, and there was a little bit of bleeding over. I mean, you know, sometimes one might do the other and back and forth. But basically, what Puccini did was he would have the scenario, which he would assume his librettist would be working on. They would then send him bits and pieces, and he would then start writing on that. And even if he didn't have things that they had given him, he was working on other stuff. He was revising things. He was maybe looking ahead a little bit. He was thinking about the story in the abstract. But there was a kind of a division of labor. If Puccini didn't get anything, as I mentioned, he would goad them. And occasionally he would actually, in fact, in Liu's aria in Act 3, he wrote the words himself. And then would send them to the librettist and say, this is kind of what I want you to do. And then they'd send him something and he'd just blow it off and say, well, I wrote the words. So. Yes. No, that's another very good question. When the librettists get involved, Puccini had not written the music. It's sort of an odd dynamic because the collaborative process with writing an opera is something that we don't think very much about. It's very much driven by the text that the librettists give to the composer. He has to have something to generate the music. Now, he may be thinking about sort of the music in the abstract, kind of a general sound world. And Puccini was doing things like researching Chinese melodies. He had found some Chinese tunes that a friend of his who had been in China had brought back on a music box. So he was doing some preliminary research. But it's not a case where you kind of write a tune and then you send it to the librettist and say, okay, give me some words to fill that music. It had to be really more the other way around. Yes? How successful? Well, that's an interesting thing because Puccini was in kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. Now, of course, he was dead, so it didn't matter to him. But well, it's true. It didn't matter to him. Puccini's admirers were actually rather disappointed in the work because what they wanted was essentially a repeat of La Boheme. They wanted a story with a kind of a demure heroine, someone they could identify with, and Puccini writes this opera with a very harsh, very difficult title character, and they felt in a sense sort of betrayed. On the other hand, Puccini's detractors, and there were many, many detractors, felt that Puccini really, he was either repeating himself, which doesn't make a lot of sense because Puccini's admirers said he's not repeating himself, or they criticized him because his opera wasn't modern enough. Now, what's sort of odd about this is that Puccini was very aware of what was going on in the musical world in 1920, 21, 22. He knew the music of Stravinsky, he knew the music of Schoenberg, he knew Debussy, he knew what was going on. And by the time he came to write Turandot, he was trying to move beyond writing another Bohème, writing another Butterfly. He wanted to write something. In one of his first letters to one of his librettists, he said, we need to come up with something modern. But the criticism was that his modern music was sort of a pose. It was kind of modern light. You know, it was sort of dissonant, but then he turns around and writes a beautiful aria for Liu in Act 1. Or he writes this beautiful music for her in Act 3. So it's like he never committed. Despite that fact, the opera was performed and it immediately took off. And it was performed pretty regularly, and within just a year of its premiere at La Scala, it was performed in Australia. So it was at least, if not a huge hit, it was performed quite regularly. Yeah, right behind you.
Yes, did the librettist and Puccini get paid during this time? Why did it take the librettist so long?
Why did it take them so long? Well, as I mentioned, they were doing other things. They had other jobs. And by this time, the idea of a full-time librettist was just simply an anachronism. So Adami was a playwright, and he was involved in the Italian film industry. Simone was the drama critic for a newspaper in Milan. So they had other things. And I think for them it was a case of priorities, and I think maybe at some point they probably realized that this is really difficult, and Puccini was just being a real jerk. So, you know, they had to kind of, it's like if we just keep ignoring it, maybe it'll go away. I don't know. Yes?
And my idea is that if the three of them had ever really gotten together and sat down in the same room, it would have gone much more smoothly.
Well, that's a good point. She said if the three of them had gotten together, they did get together.
Actually, I put
yes.
correspondence.
Yeah, no, they did get together. They would meet each other in Milan, and they would come to his villa. But again, they were doing other things, and it was easier for them to do things via correspondence than it was. Maybe the mail was slow, I guess. But they were writing each other practically every day, so there was no, you know, dearth of communication between them all. Yes?